After Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party's big victory in the United Kingdom's general election, what does it mean for Brexit and Britain? Hello, I'm Mike Walter, filling in for Anna Naidu, and this is The Heat. Prime Minister Boris Johnson and his Conservative Party won a landslide victory in British elections last week, and he is already making plans for his new government. After years of division over Brexit, Johnson campaigned on getting an agreement through the House of Commons that will finally see the United Kingdom leave the European Union, and after he says it's time for his country to heal.
I frankly urge everyone on either side of what are, after 3.5 years, after all, an increasingly arid argument. I urge everyone to find closure and to let the healing begin.
But despite his large majority, Johnson faces many challenges, such as the economy. There has also been lots of international reaction, including from U.S. President Donald Trump, who says he is anxious to do a big trade deal with the UK. So joining us now to discuss all of this from London is Helen Thomas. She is the founder and CEO of the consulting company BlondeMoney, and she's a financial and political analyst. Also joining us from London is Ian Black. He is a visiting senior fellow at the London School of Economics. With us from Belfast is Klaus Larres. He is a professor of history and international affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And with me here in the studio is Joel Rubin. He is a former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. I want to welcome all of you to the broadcast. Helen, why don't I begin with you? Big victory. This is kind of a Margaret Thatcher thumping, if you will. The Conservatives winning big here, and Boris Johnson already sounding rather buoyant. Let's listen to what he had to say.
We're going to do some fantastic things. Our country's now embarked on a wonderful adventure. And we're going to recover our national self-confidence, our mojo, our self-belief. And we're going to do things differently and better.
Getting their mojo back. And a lot of people saying a referendum on Brexit. How do you see it?
Well, it's certainly an unprecedented scale of victory. We must underline that. As you referred to there, the biggest Conservative majority since Margaret Thatcher swept to victory and a number of landslide wins in the 1980s. Now, that's quite important because it changes the dynamic of how Britain will be run. We've had almost a decade now of fairly weak governments, either coalitions or minorities or even just small majorities, which of course, as we have seen, has led to fragmented policy making and difficulties for governments in getting their agenda done. All of that has gone now. This is going to be a complete change in the way that Britain is run.
Ian, let me ask you about that. I spoke to a Remainer friend of mine who's in London who said even though he didn't like the outcome, he was pleased, at least to him, Brexit is kind of finished business now, and it may be a softer Brexit rather than what we were talking about before the election. Do you see it that way?
Well, there's been a lot of speculation, and the short answer is that we don't know. The fact is, as Helen pointed out, that Boris Johnson has a very, very significant majority. He's able to do more or less what he wants. The question is whether he will ignore the Conservatives who wanted a harder Brexit at any price, or whether he will move to a softer Brexit that will do, hopefully, less damage to the British economy. But we simply don't know. Of course, it is not true to say that Brexit is over. Probably by the end of January, Britain will formally leave the European Union. But that's only the beginning of a very complicated story. It's like a divorce where a couple agrees to separate, but the whole question of their future relationship, including matters as important as access to their children, really need to be resolved. So it's not over yet. It'll happen on January the 31st, but that's only the beginning of a story, and it could go on for a very, very long time.
And Klaus, let's talk about that, because it takes two to tango. In any divorce, one gets the house, the other gets the pets and the car or whatever. The EU also factors into all of this. How do they respond to this, and how are they taking it?
Yeah, the EU certainly has some regrets. I think that Johnson won. At least there was a secret hope that perhaps Brexit could be avoided altogether and that Britain wouldn't leave at all. But there's also now some sort of relief in Brussels because at least we know where we stand. We know that order and stability will come back to the British Parliament, and there is a Prime Minister with a large majority who can get things through Parliament. So it is clear that the withdrawal agreement, which was negotiated by Boris Johnson a couple of months ago, that will be put to the Parliament again, and the House of Commons will, in all likelihood, pass that. But that is only chapter 1. After that, chapter 2 will be the transition period and the implementation period, and Johnson still has to decide, as Ian Black just said, he still has to decide if he wants to move towards a more harder Brexit or to a softer Brexit. And here clearly the hope in the EU is that it is only realistic to negotiate the implementation period and then the transition, the chapter 2, so to speak, and to conclude that by December 2020, which Boris Johnson wants to do if the UK sticks largely to the rules and regulations of the EU. If Johnson decides that he wants to do away with that altogether and wants to really renegotiate Britain's relations to the EU, then a lot longer time span is needed. And then, of course, we can still face the dilemma of having perhaps a hard Brexit after all. And even a no-deal Brexit is essentially still possible.
And Joel, we've got the EU perspective, we've got the perspective there in the UK. There's been a lot of reaction here in the United States. There was a column out this weekend, there's been several like this. I'll just read a little bit of it. Labor's defeat, its fourth election loss in a row, could influence the thinking of many Democratic U.S. voters as they pick a nominee next year. A lot of people saying Jeremy Corbyn, too far left, American politicians, too far left. People don't accept that. In fact, the President of the United States weighed in on this. Let's listen to what Donald Trump had to say about whether or not this is a harbinger of things to come.
I want to congratulate Boris Johnson on a terrific victory. I think that might be a harbinger of what's to come in our country. It was last time.
When he says last time, Brexit, then he wins, Boris Johnson wins. He's saying, basically, if they go too far left, I win again. What's your take on that?
Well, Britons don't vote in American elections, so I don't think that he can count on them voting for him in November next year. And the analogies are very short because Jeremy Corbyn was a very flawed candidate that's come out now in the after-action assessments, but that was also known before. But his primary flaw was that he had no message. He really wasn't clear about where he stood on Brexit. Leave or stay, he didn't want to give a clear enough answer. And that's not where the Democrats are, certainly not on our left with Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren. They're very clear in their policies. So it's a mismatch analogy, and I think the president's just trying to put out some hope out there. But he does have a good relationship with Boris Johnson. And that is going to lead into interesting negotiations next year between the U.S. and the UK on a free trade agreement. And that is going to impact American politics, too. So he may want a bit of Boris magic over here, but it won't be because of the election. It'll be because of the FTA.
And we'll talk a little bit more about trade in just a minute. But I know that you've been up on Capitol Hill. There's been a lot of talk leading up to the Brexit, I mean, not the Brexit vote, but this vote itself, and a lot of discussion about Brexit. Yeah. What are you hearing up on Capitol Hill?
Well, for Democrats, there's been a big concern about the idea that Brexit, if going through, would have a negative impact on multilateral institutions like the EU. And so Democrats have been very hesitant to endorse or bless any kind of agreement between the U.S. and the UK that sort of approves of the idea of countries separating out from the EU. So that's a big motivator there. For Republicans, a lot more support, and certainly a lot more support for more free trade agreements. That's been the dominant discussion. But the bigger picture issue up there as well is the Good Friday Agreement. There's a significant chunk of Irish Americans in particular who have major political influence on Capitol Hill, certainly amongst Democrats, and they don't want any changes to the Good Friday Agreement. Nobody on the Hill has any appetite for going backwards in that front.
Helen, before we leave Corbyn and get into some of the deeper issues that Joel just touched on, I want to ask you about Corbyn, because a lot of people say maybe this was a vote about Brexit, but also maybe it was a referendum on Corbyn, that he just didn't connect with the voters. What's your take on that?
Well, absolutely. Some of the polling has shown, they've asked voters, why did you not go for the Labour Party? And the number one reason was its leader. Now, the key thing here, I think, is that 2 years ago, when the Labour Party did better than expected in the last election, which obviously denied Theresa May her majority, at that point, Jeremy Corbyn was new. He was being introduced to the general public. We've had 2 more years since then, and on a range of subjects, unfortunately, he had been portrayed and come out in a more negative light in terms of things like national security, over, of course, issues of racism and anti-Semitism. And whatever the truth of some of these issues, it's been hard for him to emerge as a leader because, frankly, when troubles rumble on in your party and you don't deal with them, then it's a management problem. So, look, the thing was really, it was an election where there was a divided population in terms of the Brexit question, but there was also a division over who do you want to lead this country. And on a number of factors, although there were some natural Labour voters who might have quite liked some of the economic policies of Jeremy Corbyn, they just couldn't see him leading the country for a number of reasons, including things like appearing to be less nationalistic than some voters in some of these Labour heartlands might have wanted. So it is a slightly more complex story, but look, at the end of the day, the Conservative Party strategy was we're picking a side and we're going to pick this leave side, we're going to leave the European Union, and at the same time, can you trust this man with the economy and with the security of the nation? And there were enough voters that were worried about that, which put their vote, they lent their vote to the Conservative Party, and that's what helped to deliver such a large majority.
And Ian, obviously this is a period of self-reflection for Labour. Where does the party go after this?
Well, I think it's going to be engulfed in a civil war, frankly. I mean, since the election last Thursday, it's just a few days, we've seen possible contenders for the party leadership line up. 2 of them are having quite an ugly spat already today. I think that you will see a struggle for the very soul of the Labour Party. I mean, it's important to remember that Jeremy Corbyn is the most left-wing leader of the party in a long time, in living memory, in fact. And there's always been, since the Tony Blair years, Tony Blair was the most successful British Prime Minister in recent times, albeit marred by, certainly in British public opinion, by the war in Iraq of 2003, but he was a moderniser, he was a reformist, he was a centrist, and the Labour Party under Corbyn has moved far to the left, and the scale of this defeat, I mean, people in Labour heartlands of the north of England and the Midlands who'd always voted for the Labour Party, voted Conservative. So I think there is a battle about to be waged for the future of the party, with Boris Johnson going to be in office probably for the full 5 years of his term. So it's going to be an uphill struggle, and it's going to be very, very bitter and divisive. You know, the Brexit itself has been a hugely toxic issue for the last 3.5 years. And I think we're now going to see, in a sense, the replaying of that in terms of the future direction of the Labour Party. But we'll know more within a few weeks when the new leader emerges.
Joel?
Well, there's one thing we do know about the result, which is that Boris Johnson now owns this and he owns Brexit. And that also puts him in a very precarious position politically. These middle-of-the-road voters who swing Labour and now swing Conservative, we've had that too in our politics. We had moderate voters go for Obama, then they went for Trump, then in the 2018 midterms, back to the Democrats. So if he doesn't manage this right, he could see those voters quickly turn around against him. The question is, for Labour, will they be a landing pad? Will they be the ones that can capture the moderate to swing voters, or will they be so extreme that they're going to continue to not find their voters, and those voters will be left abandoned and not really have a home to go to?
And Klaus, let's talk about some other voters
Can I just, yeah?
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I think in the United States you have the widespread impression, also in the White House, that now on the 31st of January, Britain leaves the EU, and then everything is new, and then Johnson can start negotiating a new trade agreement with the United States and other countries. And that is, of course, not correct. There's at least a one-year transition period before something like that can happen, and Britain really, truly leaves EU institutions and the regulations and rules. And I think that is not really fully realized in the United States.
Well, Klaus, to your point, let's listen to the U.S. president. I want to get your thoughts on the backside of this. Let's listen to what he had to say about trade between the United States and the UK.
And it's going to be a great thing for the United States also, because it means a lot of trade, tremendous amount of trade. They want to do business with us so badly. Under the European Union, it was very, very hard for them to do business with us.
So let me get your thoughts on this. He's almost giving the impression that this is going to be a done deal. As you described it, Larry Kudlow also talking about making a trip over to the UK in the near future.
Yeah, it's not a done deal, of course. These negotiations usually take a long time. The EU-Canadian negotiations took several years to conclude that trade deal, and a trade deal between the United States and the UK will be a long-term affair. And we know from history that the United States is not particularly generous or not particularly benign towards its trading partners, even to an appreciated partner and a special partner like the United Kingdom. In the past, the United States was not particularly forgiving and negotiated as hard as they possibly could. And I think we can expect the same from the Trump administration, which is, of course, fair enough. Any country would do that, but that takes time. So a trade agreement between the UK and the United States will take several years to negotiate properly. And, of course, in the end, the UK is a relatively small country compared to the rest of the EU. It is much more important for the United States to have excellent trading relations with the EU as such than with just a relatively small country like the UK.
And Helen, let me ask you about this, because there were concerns during the election about what's going to happen with the healthcare system in the UK once a deal's worked out with the United States. That was one of the basic threats Labour was using, like, this is not going to be a good thing for us.
No, you're right. That was a hugely emotive issue. The National Health Service here is a huge employer, a very emotional issue for many people in Britain. And yes, that was a real trigger when there's this question of, is it on the table in trade talks? But look, I think to Klaus's point there, yes, trade deals, of course, take a long time to thrash out. We're seeing exactly this in progress, of course, even with the US-China discussions that have been going on for some time, where now we have some kind of conclusion, but it's phase one, just phase one of how many phases. I mean, you know, we all know how long these things can take. And I think what was very interesting about the words that Mr. Trump used in that clip, you know, he said about the UK, they want a deal very badly. And of course, as Klaus was just saying there, you know, in any negotiation, it's who's going to budge first. And Mr. Trump would be right to, you know, press his advantage if he feels that, look, Boris Johnson needs a quick win and he might give way to whatever the US demands. But look, you know, trade is going to be a huge issue for years to come, huge election year in the US. Trump is now doing his favorite art of the deal, and he can play everybody off against each other because, of course, there's the ongoing EU trade negotiations with the US as well. So it's going to be quite a volatile period where everybody's trying to claim the upper hand over everybody else. But at least, I guess, from the UK perspective, at least now the government will be united in terms of its front and what it tries to pursue. But trying to balance all of these different relationships is going to be very much a challenge for Boris Johnson in this first year of his administration.
And Joel, what's the view here in Washington?
Well, certainly the view is that, yes, that might be the next one on the table. We just had a bit of a roadblock moved to the side last week with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, USMCA, which looks like it's going to get through Congress. There might be a few hiccups this week in Mexico, but that was a roadblock from a trade perspective on Capitol Hill. Now that's through. The China discussions are ongoing. I think that the president, if he leans into this, he's going to start to get some momentum, but he'll get resistance from Democrats, again, concerned about the Northern Ireland peace through the Good Friday Agreement and ensuring that any kind of a deal does really advance American interests with Britain, but also maintains the European Union, maintains multilateralism, doesn't undermine those institutions. That kind of triangular negotiation is definitely going to be complex, but that's where Democrats are going to come out.
And Ian, you were going to jump in. What are your take on this? Ian?
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you were talking to me. Look, Britain's been a member of the European Union for 45 years, okay? This is the world's most highly integrated and successful single market. We are, with this election result, entering uncharted territory. It's a very, very volatile situation indeed. Again, the Boris Johnson slogan, "Get Brexit done," is only the beginning. That's a slogan. The reality is going to be much more complex, it'll take much, much longer. The uncertainties are enormous. It's true that he has on his side a huge majority in the House of Commons, but that doesn't guarantee that the Americans, that Donald Trump will come up with a trade deal, and that the European Union will bend to British wishes. The European Union has the responsibility to its 27 remaining members to maintain the integrity of their single market, the standards that go with it, whether it's environment or workers' rights. This is a story that Brexit is only just beginning, and we are facing, a whole series of unknown situations, potential crises in the coming months and possibly years.
And Klaus, you're there in Belfast. I know that.
If I may come in.
Yes. Well, let me ask you. I do have a question, and then you can also talk about what Ian just said. Sinn Féin is taking a border poll, putting the issue of Irish reunification on the agenda. Of course, we know that nationalists won more seats than unionists. Give me your take on how things sit there in Northern Ireland, where you are right now.
Yeah, I mean, Boris Johnson has essentially sold the DUP down the road. He threw them under the bus. He basically negotiated a withdrawal agreement which included a trade barrier in the Irish Sea that prevented a hard border, which was good, which was appreciated by the EU, and therefore the withdrawal agreement was concluded. But essentially, inspections will now have to take place between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. And that was clearly a blow to the DUP. That really has been much appreciated by the nationalists, and you can actually argue that English nationalism has helped Irish nationalism to move Northern Ireland closer to the Republic of Ireland. And that was, of course, something the DUP has absolutely abhors. And in the recent elections, we saw that the DUP has lost 2 seats. They became weaker. And Sinn Féin didn't have a great success either. They also lost 6.9% of the vote overall, but at least they kept their 7 seats, so they're not taking their seats in the Westminster Parliament. But regarding Northern Ireland, so far Boris Johnson hasn't done any favors to the Northern Irish, certainly not to the DUP. And whether he will suddenly discover his Northern Irish conscience and do something for maintaining the union, that must be questioned. At the moment, it doesn't look like it. He seems to have much less of a connection, much less of a spiritual engagement with Northern Ireland than had, for example, Theresa May and other conservative prime ministers.
And Helen,
and he's also.
Go ahead, Ian.
Well, no, I mean, Boris Johnson, on the key question of the creation of a border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, he simply denied doing that. But he has indeed agreed to customs checks between the rest of the UK and Northern Ireland in order to preserve the integrity of the single market in the Republic of Ireland. So I mean, it's important to emphasize in all this, Johnson's credibility in terms of his ability to tell the truth is not taken for granted, and that's a very English understatement.
Well, Helen, let's talk about another piece of this. The voters in Scotland, they voted as well. Let's listen to the SNP leader.
The stunning election win last night for the SNP renews, reinforces and strengthens the mandate we have from previous elections to offer the people of Scotland a choice over their future. That mandate says that it is for the Scottish Parliament, not a Westminster government, to decide whether and when there should be a new referendum on independence.
And we know the last referendum lost, but this time around things could be different. If you can leave the EU, we can leave the UK, seems to be the message from Sturgeon.
Absolutely, and you know, she's playing her cards well, given the result that she got in that vote last week. I mean, it's a huge number of seats. Practically almost all the seats in Scotland are now in the hands of the Scottish nationalists. And of course, it's fair and right for her to then demand another poll on independence. The polling, however, is not quite so clear-cut as to whether that would be won, but it's slightly academic at the moment because it does require the Westminster government, Boris Johnson, would need to allow them to have that referendum take place, and with his huge majority, he can do what he wants. So probably, although they're agitating in Scotland for this poll, it may have to wait until 2021, which is when the devolved Scottish Assembly will have its own election, and we will see, you know, even more then potentially could be the demands for Scottish independence. But yes, as I'm sure you know the viewers are aware, Scotland largely wanted to remain in the European Union. So this is a serious headache for Boris Johnson. Even as he sits and basks in the glow of this victory, there is a real thorn in his side from that result in Scotland.
Ian, we've got about 45 seconds left.
But isn't there an economic question?
Go ahead, Klaus.
Isn't there an economic question which actually hasn't really featured so far? Because the UK, the rest of the UK, is by far Scotland's largest economic partner, and the EU is, I think, 1/4 of that is actually trade between Scotland and the EU. So if Scotland left the UK, it would actually do harm to its trading relations with its largest trading partner in the world. And I wonder whether that really would be something the Scottish people in the end decided in favor of. So I think Brexit and now the most likely departure of the UK from the EU has actually changed the atmosphere and the picture regarding Scottish independence in an economic sense.
Joel, I'm going to throw the last question at you. You got about 20 seconds. We're coming to the end of 2019. By the end of 2020, are we still going to be talking about Brexit?
Oh, we'll still be talking about Brexit. It's going to come up as far as the vision for the candidates and what they see America's role in the world as being about. Is it an America first on our own and every country for themselves, or is it more multilateral? And that will definitely carry on in
multilateralism, still a question. Thanks so much, Joel, and to our rest of our panelists, really appreciate it. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Walter in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.